Welcome to the Digital Agency Growth Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Englander. John, nice to have you back on the show.
Dan, it's a pleasure to be here, man.
Yeah, I think this is the third one, the trio here, the third of the trilogy. And we're kind of doing, I think what it sounds like is a little bit of a casual book episode, like a book and review episode. How does that sound?
Oh, I would like nothing more in the world to experience that with you.
Yeah, that sounds good, man. It's funny because I was just saying, like, my eyes are just drifting to the shelf. So I'm thinking about I'm thinking towards the more profound books that I've read, but I'm going to start out with more current stuff that's on the docket, right? And the business book that I've been reading lately, and I might be late to the party on this one, is Alex Hormozi's book, $100 Million Offers. Have you heard of this one?
I have, yeah. Is it any good? I haven't read it.
Yeah, it is really good. And Hormozi is one of these guys that's like kind of a can't judge a book by the cover thing. And it's not him or anything he says, but it's like the way, like the sort of marketing he does. If you, from the outside looking in, like at face value, it's very easy to lump him in with like any of the get rich quick, click funnels, YouTube kind of bro scene
guy, right? Like,
yeah. So the way he does marketing is like, it's very easy to kind of lump him in if you're not paying attention with the people that are like, hey, follow this blueprint and you'll make $1 million or whatever. But but once you read his stuff, he's actually thinking about things on a much deeper level. And I've really been enjoying the book. So anyway, yeah, his background is in gyms. So he was like a gym guy and did really well with that. And then like built it into a community and so on. And now he's essentially looking to invest in businesses between $3 and $10 million. So that's like his core business. And it's an interesting model because there's no click to opt in on anything. And he's not trying to build like usually people writing business books are either trying to sell a service or they're trying to sell like a community or courses or whatever. Right. But his whole thing is like, he just wants to invest in companies at about 3 to 10 million and become a minority or majority partner, I guess. So, but anyway, to get into the book, I'm really into like these books that kind of let you reinterpolate what works for consumer marketing into B2B. Because I think like a lot of the times in the B2B world, we overcomplicate things and we like make it boring as opposed to like kind of linking onto like the emotional stuff that works. So there's lots of good stuff in this book. I think the thing that's like the most poignant is he has this value equation, right? Which is like how you develop. It's all about how to develop like really strong offers. And the whole thing is, it's like an equation, like with a division line, and the top line is the dream outcome times the likelihood of achievement divided by time it takes to achieve that times the effort and sacrifice, right? So it's one of these things that like you kind of think about haphazardly, but it's like it's condensed really well there. So I've been thinking about that in terms of how we structure our offer and that kind of thing.
Does he have like the workbook stuff in there where like, now in this chapter, I want you to pause it and I want you to write these things down? Does he do any of that?
Not much. And yeah. What's your thought on that? The sort of like,
dude, I hate that. Like, I mean, I like there's a great book. The guy's brilliant in his approach, the Profit First book, right?
Right.
Like, I remember I was on like a long road trip and he's like, I want you to pause this right now. I want you to pull over. And I can't remember what he said to write. I was like, well, screw this guy. I'm not doing that, Yeah. But then I like have this issue where like, well, now I don't want to continue. And I think I didn't go back to the book for maybe like a year. Because, just like, all right, I'm not going to do the work right now. I'm busy.
It's funny because it's like it depends how they frame it, right? Because there's that kind of like hubris that you can have as a business book author where you're like, you either do this or you're going to get lost in the dust. There's only one way. You're either serious about this, but it's like, dude, you haven't earned that right yet. Like, I got this book on a wreck, and you're at the gym, you're driving. Like, come on. There should be a choose your own adventure thing where it's like, if you're ready to do that, that's what I tried. I mean, shameless plug. That's what I tried to do with my book coming out is like, there is a workbook chapter, but I say it at the beginning and it's like, skip over this chapter until you're ready to do live work and then so on and so forth. So there's fair warning, but the rest of it is just listenable in a car or at a gym or whatever. Yeah,
you're not asking somebody to pull over in the mountains during a snowstorm and writing down which bank accounts need to be their profit accounts.
Yeah. Well, let's dig into that book a little bit because I've read that too. I liked it a lot. I sort of found like a modified version of Profit First that's worked pretty well for me or for us. And it's essentially just keeps us out of tax trouble. So I put the tax money away, but then the profit money is sort of like a little more fluid, but same idea. Have you applied the lessons from that, or what's been your thought on profit first?
I think it's a great concept, but yeah, in its like most infantile state, like I just created like a profit account and bank account. I also use it on like a personal level, right? So there's like certain things I want to do. I just set like auto things that go up. But anybody I recommended it to just shrugged it off and like, yeah, dude, that's the envelope method. Yeah, whatever. I don't need to read the book. But I think there's the others that are just like die hard, man. And they have like, probably their banker's nightmare where they probably have like 60 accounts in there because that's kind of how he wants you to do it. Like he wants you to fund like every single thing, which is just insane to me.
Yeah, and there is like an admin cost to that that's pretty high. Plus, just like paying fees and stuff is annoying. So I think you can kind of make it your own. I would say, as while we're on the topic of accounting books, my favorite is Big Numbers, whatever it's called. You know the one? Just I have it in Kindle. Let me just pull it up. It is Simple Numbers, Straight Talk, Big Profits by Greg Crabtree.
Dude, yeah, okay, I've read that book. All right, yeah, he actually spoke another plug at one of our digital mastermind events like 8 years ago. Whenever he first published that book, he came out. I love that book.
Yeah, that was really cool. That was just sort of like like the title, straightforward. Here are the numbers you need to look at. Here's the stuff that matters. Kind of take on things.
Yeah, he's a great speaker too. I mean, my biggest takeaway in that book was the salary cap thing, like NFL teams. I just love that. It's like, look, this is all we got to spend. Either if you want more, like this is all we're putting into this bucket. So you got to go find another team. You're now a free agent.
Right. And I think that it's sort of like I've been thinking about that book alongside a lot of other interesting articles that I was reading. Like did you ever read Jason Cohen's blog, A Smart Bear?
I believe so, but I don't think it's one I've read in a while.
This is kind of semi-related, but he was writing an article about SaaS businesses and about how there's all this like funny math that's being done in terms of like customer acquisition and how much SaaS businesses will spend to acquire a customer and how like it just doesn't make sense half the time. And the interesting examples that he pulled up, and I might be butchering this a little bit and we'll try to get it linked up, is even the most successful like B2B SaaS companies or non-B2Bs like Salesforce still will have a cost of goods sold or like a gross profit that's not like a far throw from many service businesses. It's better. It's like probably like 60-70% cost of goods sold. So it sort of makes the argument that like this idea that you're just going to play with funny numbers and spend all this money so that you could like make a profit later in any business, a service business, much less like a SaaS business, doesn't, or the other way around, doesn't make a lot of sense. So it sort of like was an argument for just getting your profits correct from the beginning and not thinking like you were just going to keep passing the buck.
Yeah. I mean, that reminds me, I mean, Jason Fried, also another great author as well. I love his approach where he's taken Basecamp, where he always like, if it's not making money, it doesn't make sense. And I believe if you start out with that on a fundamental level, you can attract great investors. I mean, hell, he got Jeff Bezos, right? Years ago, and he's had a profitable company for I don't even know how long now. And I think that's one thing that he's always communicated. That's really a strong point. Even when we get into businesses, we'll see like SaaS companies and you start talking about those numbers and it's just wild. It's like, what are we here for? Like, I mean, you guys aren't even going to be able to survive unless you get it straight.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up Jason Fried because he was also kind of bubbling around in my head as I was talking about that. What's your take on, have you read Rework and Doesn't Have to Be Crazy at Work? Like what's running an agency, bigger team? What's your take on that ethos? Maybe we should give a summary for people that don't know it, I guess, first. So Rework and then the sequel, which is It Doesn't Have to Be Crazy at Work. Their argument is that this whole idea of just like a work all the time culture doesn't have to exist. You should, it's very centered on lifestyle, I guess. How else would you describe it?
Yeah, I think it's there's another work, Don't Make Me Manage or something along those lines. And it's ROW, right? A work-oriented, work environment or something. A results-oriented work environment. Sorry, a little dyslexia shown there. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's like, all right, time doesn't matter, right? It's just the things that you have to do within whatever that allotted amount of time is. And you can do it whenever you need to do it, as long as you hire the right people and you create an environment where they're allowed to produce.
Yeah, and I think that it's a really good model because it's, you know, it offers like an alternative to just grinding it out. But I do think that there's a little bit of like blindness to the amount of leverage or work that they probably had to do at the beginning, you know, before they had the company to like build to have this like moat around everything that they did. May not be the case in your industry, right?
Yeah,
Better or
and I think
worse.
it depends on your culture, the types of people you hire, right? So if you have a training company, right, where you hire younger people and then you train them up with the hopes that they'll stick around, they don't have those they don't have the framework to do that, right? So if you hire people from other backgrounds, and maybe you can create that, but I look at businesses like Fingerprints, right? So it might work for one, but it might not work for another. I know it does not work for us. We have some people that can start at like 7 a.m. and they can get off at 4, or I'm sorry, they can get off at like, 3. And, we have some different things like that. But at the end of the day, we don't have that type of environment, which I love. That's what he built software around. That's works for him. And I know it works for other agencies. It just doesn't happen to work for ours.
Yeah, and I wonder like how many is that something that's very case dependent to a software business and the nature of like building software, or does it have application beyond that?
I think it does, but I think it like you said, you're going to have to spend at the beginning to make sure, and it also has to fit your personality. It doesn't fit my personality, I think, because there's just too many gaps, especially when it comes to delivering marketing work. On the software side, we can do that, but I think the more agile you're going to be, you need to be there for, stand-ups, for instance. On the marketing side, things change and mistakes are made where you need to cover those gaps as quick as possible so you can hit things on deadline. And if the deadlines are too far out, you're never going to be able to execute properly anyway. But I love the theory and I like that it works for other people, but I've never been able to dunk a ball, and I'm completely okay with that. And other people can, and I appreciate their efforts and what they're able to do.
Yeah, I think that's a really good meta point, because I think like one thing that I have trouble with is being able to like read a book, agree with the argument, and then just leave it be. Like I want to start running with the stuff that's resonated with me too fast, as opposed to just being like, let's just see what happens with that one. Let's see where I can apply that as the opportunity comes along. Do you run into that, or what's your relationship like with that?
I do. And I know I'm reading a good book that's going to help me when it's stressing me out.
That's good.
Yeah, where I'm getting like a chest pain. I'm like, oh, these are all things I should have did like 10 years ago. And like, okay, all right, those are things that I want to look at and just really, really put into my business as quick as possible. And it's hard too. It's something I literally have to like fight through and then just start taking notes, because I think if you're reading a book and you're just trying to digest it and you're going to apply it later, I think, hey, that's great, that's grand. But I think you really need to reflect, as you're reading, because then it's going to stick with you. And then by sticking with you, then you can really apply the things that are necessary and you can communicate them to your team so they can actually execute.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I think like one book that I might have talked about in our previous conversations that's along those lines is The Road Less Stupid. Did I bring up that one?
Oh, that's a great book.
Yeah,
Yeah,
man.
you actually recommended it to me, and I started reading it after. Yeah.
Okay, cool. What's your take on it so far?
Yeah, I love it, and I love the audio version too. I'm happy you recommended that because he has this kind of like Southern drawl that just adds an element of flavor. I think he kind of he definitely simplifies everything in just a basic, hey, this is how a business should run. And he just lays out those fundamentals. And I believe those are, in some respects, rules that if you break those rules, you're going to be doomed to fail in whichever one of those buckets he's speaking to.
Right. Yeah, paying the dumb tax. And what I love about his book is there's no like lottery ticket numbers whatsoever. Even books that aren't super prescriptive will have some. And his is basically just like, here's how you can go about having a thought exercise that will generate your own potential lottery ticket numbers, right? So I think that's pretty cool. My biggest takeaway from that book is that it's like, don't fool yourself into thinking that you don't have a job to do.
Right.
At the same time, that job, it can often be sitting around thinking about stuff, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, and I would say that's also very similar takeaway to mine, is just like, okay, you just need to sit down and just think about everything that's going on. Now he's a little bit more focused than I am right now. I'm not like sitting down in a book and I don't have my chair and my lamp and
pipe.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. Just still mowing down cigarettes.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I think that's it. And actually I've done that for the last couple of weekends. I enjoy just getting away on a weekend and just literally thinking about some work things. I did it this weekend and I feel amazing on a Monday whenever I do that. It's like you're getting ahead of everybody.
Yeah. Can you talk about that a little bit? Like how did you go about thinking about the problems and like what came from that session?
Yeah. So what typically happens is during the week, there's a couple different things that happen. One is there's tasks that are actually projects, right? So, all right. So as those begin to, flow to the end of the week, I keep a calendar and then I put all those on a Saturday. So that's one. The other are whatever projects and problems that you're seeing. I also throw those on the calendar. And what I look at is, all right, these are things that I don't need to be doing. Obviously, I don't have the time to do them. So I need to figure out a way to delegate these to others. And then the other like projects or whatnot could be looking at budgeting numbers, could be looking at pipeline, just really having no interruptions whatsoever and coming up with something strategic so you can attack those problems. And then I just deliver all that stuff. A lot of people get emails from me at Monday at 8 a.m. I schedule send. I don't want to bother them on the weekend. Yeah. And then my box explodes, but it's a good explosion because it's usually feedback based on whatever those things are.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to do it. I've been going back and forth between doing the Sunday work or getting up Monday and then using that time for it, before things get too crazy. So that makes a lot of sense. I think to hopscotch around a little bit, another one that has been on my radar again, I'd read it a while back, then I had this person on the podcast, is Phil M. Jones's Exactly What to Say. Have you read that one?
No, I haven't.
It's a sales book, but I liked it both, based on the content that's in it, but also just like what it was trying to do as a book, which I think is like an interesting way to boil down the content that you're making for your own marketing, in a B2B context. Yeah. Because it's basically just like a series of statements or words you can use in emails or in sales contexts that are powerful. Like one of them is, if you're following up saying like, I'm guessing you haven't gotten around to X, because then either you're sympathizing with somebody or you're wrong and they'll say, oh no, I actually have gotten around to this, in which case that's good news, right? Like, yeah. And there's a number of other things like that. There's probably like a few dozen of these statements. But what's cool about it is like, I think that's a really, like, you can either go really broad and meaning of life sort of with your content or your book, or you can like really drill down and just be like, here's something you can run with right away that makes me not have to, define app development overall to you or something like that.
I like that. It reminds me of Never Split the Difference. Yeah. One of my takeaways in there was when you're trying to get I don't know if this was in the book or maybe I just came up with this from reading something else on it, but the principle is in the book. When you call somebody out when they're not getting back to you, where you're like, are you giving up?
Yeah.
And I figure out all these ways that somebody can interpret it as an insult to make them move, but it's not technically insulting. It's just their perception of what's happening. Either way, though, it motivates a response. Right. And yeah, it's one of the things I love about that book.
Yeah, I've used that a lot. It can work really well. It's like, should I assume you've given up on this project or this engagement? Or yeah. And there's a lot more in that book. That book's cool because like most business books it's like there's one core thesis and then the rest of the book is just trying to prove that thesis through like example after example. But that one is more like a handbook. Like there's different situations kind of like described throughout the whole thing. Plus it's all based on hostage negotiations. So it's all like super interesting.
Yeah. And that's a great distinction too, because I think maybe I'm more attracted to kind of the handbook side where it's just, all right, here's something like, not theoretical. This is just really snackable. Like, all right, this is what you can do with this information and just apply it immediately. Like that to me is like the sexiest stuff when it comes to business books.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm trying to think of what other business books I've read lately. But to jump to non-business stuff, one of the last ones that I read was The Path to Power, which is like the first of the Lyndon B. Johnson series that Robert Caro did. So it's
Okay.
basically these like
I read that
mammoth
book a while ago,
books.
dude. Geez, that is like the thickest book, bro.
It took a long time. It took a long time.
And then
Yeah.
like start out with like them in like like it starts out with like 200 years prior, right? Like in like
Yeah.
Austin or like East Texas or something.
Yeah. In Central Texas. Yeah. And
Way
East too.
early, bro.
Right. And it's good on so many levels because it's like it makes you realize that like a biography is one of the best ways to like understand history, because otherwise if it's just on an era or on something else, it becomes arbitrary, because it's like, what do you choose to include and what not to include, in a history of the US or Texas or whatever between 1800 and 1970 or something like that.
Yeah.
But if you have one central figure, it sort of like hones everything, so then you can
Yeah.
understand the whole era. And like Robert Caro is one of the best at this. But that was one thing I got. Another thing I got from it was just like how you kind of like know intellectually like how much we've developed, how much technology we've developed, since whatever 1900. But it's
Yeah.
another thing for like Caro to go into just like painstaking detail on rural Texas. Like this is not that rural now. This is like an hour from Austin, in the 1920s or whatever. And like just the sort of painstaking work like everybody, men, women, children, had to do to just live, without, it's basically like the same as it had been for hundreds of years. And then like we went to the moon 30 years later.
Yeah. No, you're right. I think one of my takeaways from that book was the power of certainty, right? So from the beginning of how certain he was of what he wanted, right? And he was always pretty clear with his intentions with the right people. And that helped propel him along. He didn't really settle for anything except, vice president. And then, a tragedy occurs and then he's passed the baton. So he was an interesting character, man. Like, oh, geez, some of the things that guy did to show his power was, I don't even feel comfortable saying on this podcast.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you ever hear, like, I forgot where I heard this, but like Nixon weighed in on the biography? Did you ever hear like his statement?
I wasn't aware of that.
He was just like, oh, it makes him seem like an animal. He's like a great man. Yeah. Yeah. It also leaves you with this impression that like, oh, like the great person theory of history, great man theory of history, that like like one person really can change things massively, but they have to kind of be a maniac.
Oh, dude. Yeah. I would say that he falls into that category. I mean, the guy was just, he wanted power. I think it's hard to compare somebody that wanted his power as bad as he did.
Yeah. Let me give you the baton. And what else are you reading?
I mean, on the nonfiction side, along those lines,
or whatever, fiction, nonfiction.
Nonfiction. I haven't really read too much nonfiction lately, but another book along those lines is the one about Truman, the accidental president. Yeah. Just to talk about Nassim Taleb's like kind of like accidents happen and whatnot. It's an awesome story. By all appearances, the guy was a great dude. And he deserved the role. And just, the takeaways there, I think, were just be as genuine as you can, and things, will tend to fall into place if they're supposed to. I think that's a fantastic, I'd recommend it for listening.
That's interesting. There's a whole podcast series with Louis C.K. and these other comedians called The Presidents. Have you heard of this?
No.
They just go through like each president, and they talked about Truman. I forgot exactly what their take was, but it's hilarious if you're into those guys. But yeah. So what was his deal with FDR? Didn't they not get along?
Well, FDR just didn't care about him at all. Truman was just the fill-in, right? So FDR, I can't remember. Somebody got caught for a scandal that FDR wanted to run for. I think it was a congressional position, if I'm not mistaken. And then somebody popped up and said, well, the only guy we have that has no dirt on him is this Truman guy. And he's like, whatever, he'll do. So that's essentially where he got his rise to power, from being just, I can't remember what he was. He was just like a little district guy. And so FDR just didn't really give him the time of day because he wasn't on his radar, which is very, Harvard-like.
Yeah. And it also, I think he was just known for that, for just being like scatterbrained and forgetful and, dismissive or whatever. So
cocktails.
Yeah. Everyone back then. Are there any books that you find yourself returning to?
Yeah, rereading Atomic Habits, because obviously I either have some bad habits or I'm trying to create some other good ones. So some personal stuff is something I'm always working on. So I think that's one I go back to quite often. And it's a rather recent book. One of the others too, that when I always think somebody's like, hey, what's just a book that was kind of like a shocker, right? When somebody says like a good book, I don't know if it's like the best book I've written, but it changed a lot of my thinking around strategy. It was Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. That it's a fantastic book that just really gets down to what a strategy is, what is one involved, and you can just take those things instantly and just look at strategies differently. And when someone brings one to you, you can just call it out like, this isn't a strategy, right? Or this is a bad strategy. So I think that's another one that's always had a profound effect. And what are some of the other ones? Right now I'm reading Anti-Fragile. So that's a good book. I'm digging that one. And then the other one, as a company, we're reading Traction because we're looking at taking on EOS. So that's one of those books, which we've kind of done a lot of those things, but I think it's a strong book for everybody to read because it's a fantastic system for running your business.
Yeah, I would love to reread Traction at this point. I think I read it too early when we were too small, and there were things that just didn't quite line up for us. I think it's made for like a slightly higher level, but now I think we're at a point where it would make sense to revisit. Anti-Fragile, yeah, I love that book. I read that a number of years ago. I think, current Taleb notwithstanding, like he's has some interesting opinions now. That book definitely shook up a lot of my thinking.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember everything that I kind of left with because it's massive and it goes so many places. I remember really enjoying listening to it because he picks a lot of fights, so it makes it just like really entertaining to listen to because he'll just like call out ideas and people and stuff. He's kind of like a rapper,
Yeah. No, that's a good way of looking at it. And I guess one of the other things too, I mean, I don't want to gloss over, like, dude, like anything written by Malcolm Gladwell, man, like I've always been like a huge fan of his, and those books have always had a great effect on me. So I think he falls in that line.
Yeah. I like him a lot. I didn't really like Tipping Point. There were like just some conclusions I thought he jumped to a little fast, but then I really liked the last one he did, Talking to Strangers. That was a good one.
I thought Tipping Point was good because, I mean, from the marketing side, and I read it years ago, tried to explain the virality piece, like how these things take off, right? And I always go back to, I was a skater kid in school and I had airwalks. That's one of his examples, right?
Yeah.
So I appreciate that book. Yeah. It's What the Dog Saw, I think, is another one. Talking with Strangers. Yeah. And The Outliers too is a really good one.
I think I read this really good article about, it was basically a takedown on virality on that, not just that book, but like the idea of influencer marketing and that sort of thing. And it was by a data researcher. So it was interesting because his whole take was like, hey, if there's a forest and it's ready to start fire, whoever sparks that fire, it's less important who sparks the fire. Like something's going to spark it, but that's probably not the thing that makes that's not the real reason the forest ignites. The forest ignites because it's too dry, So that was his take on virality, because he was like looking at how different messages and content pass between large groups and couldn't find any connection. And I think there's also just like an incentive to have, this idea of influencers, because then you as like the agency can control them and take all the credit and everything like that. So anyway, I don't have super strong opinions, but I thought it was like an interesting take.
I mean, I tell you what, data guys, like, so I wear like a Whoop, right? And I got a friend that's a data guy, and he's like continually refuting that the company can get as many data points as it can. So I got another buddy that's a data point and a tech guy, and like just listening to the arguments. I always think there's this counter argument to whatever, it is that we hear or we believe. And it just, I think if it appeals to certain values that we have, we're like, that's bullshit.
Well, I think the biggest one is just like is historical understanding, like domain expertise, and then like per Taleb, it's like skin in the game as well. Like, are you invested in the outcome or not? So for example, like you don't need all the data in the world for you to make a decision on like what feature is going to work in a new app you guys are building, because like you've done it enough times, like you actually do have a spidey sense for it. Maybe I'm not saying that's true, but it's spitballing an example, right? But if there was some other domain where you have no experience, like whitewater rafting or something, you might not trust your gut as much.
Right. No, and those are great points, which is also interesting too, because it makes the beg for like niche marketing and whatnot, where there's companies that, let's say that they work in hotels and they do a really good job, but when the market like takes a turn, sometimes you need somebody that's not in the jar, right? So they can read the label. And it's just one of those, flip side, silver lining type of scenarios. And we see that a lot where we'll work with a company that's been working with a niche company. We're not niche based, but we may look at a problem a little bit different because they're just so entrenched and they're used to seeing the same things. And I wouldn't say it's conditioned. Maybe it's just a sense of complacency that just organically happens.
Yeah. It kind of, have you heard of, the Chesterton's fence versus Gordian knot dichotomy? Let's see if I can do it justice. But there's the Gordian knot, which was like this giant knot.
Yeah. Okay, like Alexander the Great or something.
Exactly,
right?
And he just cut it in half because he's like, who cares? Just cut it in half. And then there's the Chesterton's fence, which I forget. I guess it originates with Chesterton or whoever. But it's the idea that like there's a fence in the middle of the woods and you don't know why it's there. So somebody with like a Gordian knot mindset would just tear it down. But maybe that fence serves a million purposes that you can't possibly predict. Maybe it's keeping livestock out. Maybe there's some other reason for it. It would be dumb just to say this fence has no use, so we should tear it down. So I think a lot of the work is trying to figure out if a problem is the Chesterton's fence or a Gordian knot.
Yeah, no, I like that approach. Yeah, I heard half of it. I didn't hear the other. So maybe I've just been cutting knots in half.
Well, I think in a modern digital context, that might be the way to do things because the costs aren't super high to fix things, right? It's not like you're building a bridge over there, right?
Well, right. Like when like Mark Zuckerberg came out and said like, oh, my motto is, work fast and, break things or whatever that is. And I just remember so many people that just were adopting this and just watching the wake of destruction based on that, because dude, that works for him. That doesn't necessarily mean it works for you. Like he has a completely different set. And I find it amazing. Or like when Steve Jobs' autobiography came out and then everybody thought that was free reign to be an asshole. It's like, dude, like don't. I mean, like that worked for him for some mysterious reason. It doesn't give you permission to be a prick to your staff.
Well, it's also just like there's a such thing as counter signals, right? Where he was like, essentially saying my product is so good and I'm so good at these few things, like identifying talent or whatever other few things he was good at, that I can like be a prick and get away with it. This is to show you how good I am at these other things. It doesn't mean that those other things that he couldn't have done even better without doing that.
Yeah, I think externally that's what we see, but I think if it's internal, I mean, he was a cult leader. Right? Okay. He created a cult that does and did amazing things. And I think that's waning a little bit with, what's happening in culture. And granted, the company is still wildly successful and so on and so forth. But that's what he did. Like he had a technique of brainwashing people, making them, get to the edge and they didn't think they could do anything. And they grew wings, right? And they do these amazing things. I think there's very few people in history that can do that. And I think it's super irresponsible of people to believe that that's what they have, right? Because I don't even think he knew that about himself. He just did it.
Right. That stands to reason. And I think that it's funny because I've actually learned more from like the things that like Bezos has written than necessarily than from Jobs, and that's not like a vouching for any given policy of Amazon's or anything like that. But I think like he's the stuff that Bezos has put out, I think has been like directly applicable to so many businesses. Like the whole making decisions with 70% information is pretty useful because the cost of waiting is too high, and that sort of thing.
Yeah. My favorite is your profit margin is my opportunity.
Yeah. That just sounds cool.
It does, dude. It's just, oh man, it's just, I'm coming for it, man. It's just, the epitome of competition.
Right. That I'm just looking over on my shelf, the other classic book, which is 0 to 1, right? Which is talks a lot about that. It talks a lot about how like the irony of capitalism is that it just incentivizes like the loss of profit through competition, which therefore destroys capitalism because all capitalism can be is profit. Otherwise, what else is it?
Yeah, love that concept. I think another like handbooky one I just looked over and saw was The Art of Client Service. Have you read that?
Yeah, I read that a long time ago. I think I had a nice email exchange with that author years ago.
Yeah. Robert Solomon, I think his name is, or something. Yeah. That's one I highly recommend to all account managers.
Yeah, that's like a very, very classic agency client service book. One that I find myself continually going back to is The War of Art. You read that one?
Dude, that's literally right next to the other one. It's so crazy.
Yeah. It's a great one. It's a great
That's
one.
Stephen Pressfield. Yeah.
It's really good. And then Turing Pro is also good. I found myself going back to that, or just like, I think I recommend that too, because you all have, like, everybody has friends. It's like, oh, I should really want to do this thing, or really want to try this product, and they never do it. It's like, just go read this book. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and I love that, the resistance part of it.
The resistance.
Yeah. What's crazy though is in reading that book, and I think some people can take away from like, okay, it's written here, I'm going to do it. But like that guy has a perfect opportunity to start like some type of program that helps people break through that. Like just do the wildest things, like just put a tweet, out there that just completely destroys their ego and their image. And I think it's a huge opportunity that I never took. I mean, that could be like the next leadership group and guru that's just built around that.
Yeah. And I think, well, with Pressfield, it's funny because it's like, I also just love the context in which he wrote it, because he's like, I'm not trying to build a consulting business or something. He's just like wrote it out of frustration because he was tired of giving advice,
Yeah.
Which is a great way to experience the book. Yeah, that's good. I think one thing I keep going back to with that book is just figuring out like where the resistance lives, because it changes. And like the thing that was the resistance in like year one of your business is not the same thing that is the resistance in year X, right? Or year N. How do you think about that now? Like, where does the resistance live for you? If that's not too.
No, man, I love going. So the weirdest thing about when you've had a business for a number of years is you now have to maintain it, right? So when you're first starting out, you can do anything you pretty much want to just try to get that next dollar. But when you have then people working under you, there's a responsibility that you have to support them. I mean, there's people that are, paying their, for their kids' college, because you've given them a career. So I think that's the new fear, right? So the other one is like the just looking, you don't want to look bad. It's like the Schroeder's cat thing. Well, if you never do it, then does it ever, are you a failure type of scenario or not? And, if you're just sitting there, you're not. So there's that. But then as you begin to grow and then you take on that responsibility, it's now, what am I going to destroy, right? Especially with cancel culture, right?
Yeah.
Dude, the more I talk, the more trouble I get. My mouth is shaped like a foot. So, I'm constantly just putting my foot in my mouth. So I think that's my new resistance. Like, oh man, I'm going to piss off somebody, or I'm going to insult somebody. And people are like, oh, like Elon Musk and these people, they don't care. It's like, well, great, grand, good for them. That's what works for them. Like when I piss off people, it hurts. I don't want to piss off people.
Yeah. And they care too. They just care in a different way, right? If anything, they have more to lose and more to be careful.
Sycophants around them. No, everything's good, bro. Yeah.
That's a whole other level. But yeah, I think that's the same for me. I think the other thing is just like, what are thinking about bigger, scarier, long-term investments? Usually it's in people, and in that sort of thing, as opposed to making a sales call or like whatever it was in year one.
Yeah. It's like switching, like, if you want to talk about like business switching, like, switching payroll companies or something like that. And then you discover, you're like, oh, wow, this was wildly oversold. And there's, tons of money that's now going to be lost and things like that. Yeah. There's just countless, decisions like that. One good piece of advice though, I got from somebody else when I told him I was a procrastinator. He said, use that to your advantage. And I was like, what? Like, what do you mean? He said, everybody that makes a decision immediately is going to be wrong a high percentage of the time. Everybody that waits to make a decision toward the end is going to be right a high percentage of the time. He said, you just got to figure out what works for you and where that mix is. And I started like looking at that, and I would wait to make decisions. You don't want to wait till the absolute last minute where you're going to lose that opportunity, but wait till the absolute last minute till it's the perfect time to do it.
Yeah.
And in doing that, oh man, some problems just figure themselves out entirely. Some opportunities, just turn into something wildly great. So I think if there's any procrastinators listening, that can be a huge advantage. The tool that you have to figure out is the timing piece. And then once you have that down, you can be wildly more successful than you were, on either category, being a first responder or being the person that just waits and it passes you by.
Yeah, I think that's really useful. And I think like as part of that, as another like point to add on to that, a lot of the times we have experiments that are already in motion and the results haven't come in yet. So you might be trying to like fix a problem that's already being worked on, that and the jury hasn't reconvened yet on that solution. So, and it's really tough because like, let's say you do something and you have a client that's dissatisfied or something, and you may already have a situation where like, oh, well, with the new client, the next person you're going to win, you've already fixed that problem. And this is, so you might as well like not worry about creating a whole new system for this situation. That's one thing that I've kind of reminded myself of.
Absolutely. And those reminders, also another great book, Principles by Ray Dalio, right? Like the whole principle of the book is really to write down your own principles of what works for you. And that's something that we've started doing a lot more, whether it's in our handbook or whatnot. Just, all right, hey, these are the things you need to remember. They're almost like little business mantras. Like, okay, this is what works here. And those in growing companies, I mean, that's something that's been super helpful. It's not necessarily so much process. It's just a way of thinking and looking at a problem.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And we covered a lot of books. I know you got to run soon, John. How's Digital Mastermind? Anything coming up? Anything you want to plug?
Yeah, man, we got our event coming up. Got a ton of attendees. Still have some tickets, some fantastic speakers. So yeah, that's October 17th, 18th, and 19th. So you can get tickets at digitalmastermind.com. And yeah, and if anybody is interested in joining the group, go ahead and shoot me an email, Jon at digitalmastermind.com, and let's have a conversation, see if you'll be a good fit.
Awesome. And John will get you into the book club, if nothing else. Sounds like you're doing a lot of reading.
Dan, I appreciate it, man. It's always a pleasure, man.
Likewise, always a pleasure. Thanks, man.